Here we are in Colorado, and today we're going to discuss a frequency study we did for wetland plant rating. And for some of you that know, and for many of you who don't know, the National Wetland Plant List really lacks data behind the ratings for frequency, and they've all been assigned from literature, herbarium data, but mostly best professional judgment. So we would like to have a system or a way that if we wanted to evaluate a better way to rate a species, we needed a scientifically sound method to do that. So what we did, we collaborated with Colorado State University and Dr. Dave Cooper, faculty there, and many of his students, and we worked with them, and they set up a study to look at blue spruce in the Rockies. And so in this video, we're going to discuss how that was done and some of the things they learned and some of the things we can take from that. So at this point, I'll pass it to David.
Yes. We chose blue spruce because it's a very common and widespread species along floodplains in the Rocky Mountains. And it's rated as a FAC, which means that half the time it should be in wetlands and half the time it should be in non-wetlands. And we thought it was a good species to develop and test this methodology with. So to get started, we chose two Bailey ecoregions in Colorado, which are right in the middle of the blue spruce's range. Chose watersheds, and Ed will then describe the stratification that we used to select the individual watersheds and get into a little more detail about the methodology used on the ground. So this is Dr. Edward Gage. He's a postdoctoral researcher at Colorado State University, and he was conducting or coordinating the field research with other graduate students.
So one of the key challenges in sampling blue spruce is it has a very broad distribution throughout the southern Rockies, but rather specific habitat preferences. Most floras describe it as a riparian species occurring along river bottoms. It also occurs along mid-slope positions in portions of its range. To sample blue spruce across the two ecoregions, we selected 22 Huck 12 watersheds, and then we used a species distribution model to identify portions of those watersheds likely to support blue spruce. Within those areas, we identified 423 individual trees randomly, and then used the regional supplement to describe hydric soil and hydrology indicators, and to determine whether that particular spruce we were sampling was located inside or outside of a wetland. Those data were then aggregated per watershed to determine whether, based on the sample size within that individual watershed, it was obligate, facultative, FAC-up, so on and so forth, and then repeated that, aggregating across our entire data set. Over all of our trees sampled, only 16% occurred in wetlands, which would make it a FAC-up as far as the indicator rating.
One of the key findings from the study was that blue spruce had different distributions in the northern part of its range within our study area than in the southern part of its range. In the northern part of the range, we have very poor rain during the summer, very little rain during the summer, and most of the blue spruce were found in these valley bottoms along streams. But as we moved south through the study area, the amount of monsoon rain increased. There was much more water available on hillsides in soil water, and blue spruce was moving up on the hillside and was very common on hillsides in upland positions. That was a surprising finding, and it helped to actually create the ratings that we found for the entire population as a whole.
So the interesting thing, as far as what we learned from this wetland rating, first, you realize that except for the few subregions that are used within the regions, 10 regions across the country. Here we have a species that we only took part of the entire Mountain Western Valley region, used two Bailey ecoregions, and within that we had a north to south pattern. We had differences between watersheds. In other words, a species ecological amplitude, if you want to refer to it as that, to wet, dry conditions varies across the landscape. So the wetland ratings are just not one stagnant rating. What we learned is it could be an upland plant in different watersheds, and in other watersheds we had some that were actually facultative. It's when we merged them all, rounded up the information that Zed referenced, we got a FAC up rating, but that's only for part of the entire region. So the challenge is, if you were going to do an entire region, how massive of a study that is, and that the 5 wetland ratings are really, they cover a lot of variation. Plants do not just act in 5 categories, even though it appears that these wetland ratings are specific to these species. There's a lot of variation in there. And Ed, how long did this take you guys to do?
Took approximately 4 months of field work, some additional work related to the GIS processing, species distribution modeling, and sampling design and analysis, but approximately 4 months.
How many people were involved?
We had, I believe, 4 technicians as well as the principal investigators that were involved in various aspects.
So at least 6 people,
yeah,
over several months, plus all the travel time, logistics to getting to all these sample points. And did you find that when you did find ones that were acting in the facultative sort of rating, were those habitats significantly different from, were they in the bottoms, along the willow edges of the streams? Where were they located?
Well, as David indicated, one of the big climatic gradients across the study region is this monsoonal weather pattern that is much more pronounced in the southern portion of our study area. And so that's where we saw blue spruce come out of the riparian bottoms. But throughout the entire study area, we would find it in lower landscape positions along valley bottoms. Just in the southern portion, it would extend out.
But even in the northern portions, when it was along a valley bottom, it really wasn't most of the time in what would be a wetland. It would be near it.
Correct. So it would be lower landscape positions, but when you actually looked at the soil and hydrology indicators, they wouldn't actually come out as wetlands.
Now,
so it'd be slightly higher up on them.
We have had people suggest to us that we should use delineation data, meaning from a boundary, how many times does it occur adjacent right there in the upland versus the wetland? And we've looked at that, and that turns out statistically to be a very biased representation, and we can't capture all this variation across the landscape. You have anything that you'd like to add to that, or any insight from what you learned about that approach of just going to a wetland boundary and using that for your frequency?
Well, in the case of blue spruce, you would miss huge portions of its distribution. So, at least in the southern portion of the study area where it extended well into mid-slope positions.
Right. So you're eliminating or ignoring its total distribution across the landscape, including all these upland areas.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I would just say in general that the biggest challenge of this study, and I think it would apply to many studies where you were trying to develop a quantitative frequency estimate, is developing an unbiased sampling design that is efficient enough to allow you to sample at a spatial scale that's significantly broad. Doing the entire mountain, valleys, and coast region would, I would say, based on our experience, one, not be efficient, and the spatial variability we saw in the indicator ratings or the frequency that we found blue spruce in wetlands suggests that that one single rating may not really be all that accurate. It could mislead you in certain portions of the range.
Okay. And would you have any suggestions as to possibly how to reduce down the scale of such a study, or to keep it adequate? in the sense of statistically adequate, or do you think it needs to be maintained at this rigor level?
It's hard to generalize, I would say, because I think, as it was with Blue Spruce, you have to start with the basic ecology and distribution of the species you're talking about, and then align that with the resources you have available to do the sampling. With that said, then you need to make sure, obviously, that you don't have a biased sampling design that will lead you to the wrong conclusion. So a lot of effort was put into trying to develop a way to spread out our sampling across our entire study area, which was quite extensive. The Southern Rockies is very rugged, a lot of wilderness areas. Travel and accessibility was a big factor. So I would say that the conclusions and the approach you would take would likely be different if you were dealing with a different type of species, with a different distribution pattern, if you were in the eastern United States versus the west. So hard to generalize.
Would you agree that at these landscape scales, one of the Achilles heels to the study is we don't have a vegetation map of the populations. And if you had a map of Blue Spruce and all of its locations, you could probably throw random points at that, where Blue Spruce in the west actually would be easier to define its habitat, say, than another species on the Atlantic coastal plain, where it just rolls for miles. And so do you agree that the lack of a species distribution map that would be reasonably accurate is one of the big stumbling blocks to setting up one of these studies?
I would completely agree. That was something that we encountered right at the very start. Is there anecdotal accounts, as I mentioned at the start, as far as where you find Blue Spruce on the landscape. And there were some maps of its broad distribution, but they were way too coarse to actually guide sampling. Blue Spruce, even in those portions of the study area where it gets out of those valley bottom locations, still probably only occurs at maybe 5% of the landscape, I would guess, maybe a little more. But regardless, it's a small portion of the landscape, and we could not sample efficiently all of that and have a sample size in the end large enough. Because again, we could only develop those frequency ratings by actually finding spruce trees, and using randomization as the way to guide your movement across that landscape will often lead you to places where there are not that target species. So you need to minimize that if you want to have any hope of developing a large enough frequency estimate.
So do you think across the study area, Blue Spruce as a species expressed a different relationship to the hydrology occurrence and the climatic conditions from north to south, so it's not consistent? And would you say that that information was exposed in any of the floras or literature you looked at before you began the study?
I would say no. Most counts, again, sort of described it as strictly a riparian species. Our data definitely suggests that it, in certain portions at least, it exists in different portions of the landscape. We had some indication just from observations. Dr. Cooper and others have seen the species in other landscape positions, so we knew that it didn't exist solely in riparian areas. One of the other sort of issues, I guess, as far as thinking about the indicator ratings of these species is it a function of their tolerance or their physiology, or how is their occurrence on the landscape related to other species? So it could be more complex than that, as far as where it occurs in the southern portion of the landscape could also be a product of some of its competitors, other tree species and the like that.
Okay.
So it's a complex question.
Right. Oh, very much so. Very much so. So that goes back to earlier. We can't put the plant kingdom into 5 categories and believe we got the answer to everything. Okay. Well, Ed and Dave, I'd like to thank you guys if you want to step back in for a minute. And that is, let me thank Dave Cooper and Ed Gage. You guys made the lunar landing for mankind. You did the first wetland statistically adequate, and I have to mention it was published in Wetlands, frequency rating for any plant on the National Wetland Plant list. So we want to thank you for that effort and for your time today, and thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Bill. Let me see, how many locations did we have? Scratch that. Can we recut here? And we used the core. God, sorry, my brain is a little. Okay. Within that, we used a species distribution model to. I already talked about that. Sorry, scratch that.